Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. My name's Stephanie, and today I'm so excited to be showing you ILNP's first fall collection of the year called After the Rain. They feature jelly bases with golden iridescent microflakies. So as always, I will save more of my thoughts for the end after some comparisons and even potential recreation attempts. But for now, let's just get into the swatches. The first shade we have is Dark Roast, which is described as a cool cocoa brown jelly with orange to green shimmering flakes. I was very excited about this one because, as you know, I love brown polish, especially any kind of specialty finish brown, but this one feels extra special because it is a cool toned brown, which we just don't see super often. It does look like it has a bit of a milk chocolate sort of vibe, but as you'll see later during the comparison portion, it's not as warm as a lot of other milk chocolates, but you could get some of that warmth depending on how many coats you do. So as you saw, the formula on this was pretty nice. It wasn't the most even coverage on the first coat, but I think it looked really passable on 2 coats, mainly because it is a bit of a darker shade, but I could see this one benefiting from a 3rd if you really want to deepen that brown color. So for my full hand swatch, I am showing 2 coats, but I am wearing a blurring base coat on my ring and pinky, so hopefully you can see that that just provides a bit more full coverage. Now that I'm growing out my nails, you can see a little bit more free edge on my pointer and middle fingers, but if you don't have a lot of free edge, I think you could just stay with 2. Next we have Raincoat, which is the rustic orange filled with gold to green shimmering flakes. This one is another absolute beauty. I mean, you can't go wrong with a rusty orange for fall, and I would say this one had a really pigmented formula. I found it very full coverage and very even coverage on the first coat, especially compared to Dark Roast, which was a lot more sheer. So this one built up really beautifully on just 2 coats for me, where I would say it's really passable, but you know, if you look close enough, you might be able to see a hint of nail line. Even for my full hand swatch, which again is showing 2 coats with top coat in direct sunlight, I feel like it was pretty hard to see the visible nail line with this shade compared to the last one. Specifically for my pointer and middle fingers, because again, that's just with the clear base coat, while I have the blurring base on my ring and pinky. I feel like the blurring base didn't do that much for this shade, so you might not need it. Up next we have Ginger Snap, and this is described as a gingerbread brown filled with orange to green flakies. For some reason, I feel like this wasn't picking up 100% color accurate, but I would say it's like 95% there. I think I would say in real life, the base color is a bit warmer, like there's a more noticeable red kind of undertone that I just don't think is really translating that well on camera. To me, at least, it looks like it's a bit more yellow leaning, though maybe that's just the flakies. Either way, it is a super cozy, super beautiful polish. I thought it had a pretty decent formula, but on the second coat, I feel like you still could see a good amount of visible nail line. So I did end up doing a 3rd for this one, and I just loved how the color intensified. I do think it's a bit more color accurate here in my full hand swatch since it's in direct sunlight. Again, I am wearing 2 coats, so hopefully you can see just how sheer it is on my pointer and middle fingers with the clear base coat. I think there's still a hint of it using the blurring base, but it's not that noticeable, or at least not enough for me to do a 3rd coat. Finally, moving away from the browns, the next polish we have is Stormwatch, and this is a cool light gray jelly, again filled with those same orange to green shimmering flakes. This one had a lovely formula that was very smooth and even coverage. It is just very, very sheer on that first coat. You barely get that wash of gray color. It does start to build up in 2 coats where it's just more noticeably gray, but it still is also very noticeably sheer, I would say, which isn't a surprise considering this and Ginger Snap are the lightest colors of the lineup. So this is another one that I probably would recommend doing a 3rd coat, especially if you want to intensify the gray base even more. But doing just 2 coats I think gives it a really beautiful, softer shade of gray. Or again, you can also use a blurring base coat like I am on my ring and pinky just to help with the coverage a bit more. I don't think I've talked about it too much already, but I really love how the flakies in these just glow, especially in lower lighting. That's where iridescent flakies or shimmers usually pop the most. They just look like little embers. So we got two blues in this collection, and the first one is called Jumping Puddles, which is described as a slate blue jelly base, again with those same orange to green shimmering flakes. I also don't think I've mentioned this yet, but regarding the flakies, I feel like they predominantly are orange to yellow, but I did see more pops of the green in the two blue shades, though I wonder if that's because the bases are blue and then layering with the yellow of the flakies, it just makes them look green. So it could be a color theory thing, but I just honestly didn't see much of the green in the previous shades, especially the browns. Back to this blue though, it is super gorgeous. It didn't look super promising on the first coat though. It was very sheer, and I would say the least even coverage on the first coat, so I thought I was gonna need 3 for this, but I think it is pretty passable on 2, at least for my live swatch. Again, for my full hand swatch, the 2 coats on my pointer and especially my middle finger, I think you can see a bit more visible nail line. And rounding out the collection, we have Drizzle, which is just described as a deep blue jelly with the same orange to green shimmering flakes. I was pretty surprised with how pigmented this was, because usually darker jelly bases can be surprisingly sheer, but as you can see, this is definitely very full coverage on the first coat alone. Maybe not the most even, there are definitely some sheer spots here and there, but it does even out really beautifully and build up to basically full opacity in just 2 coats. Though I guess that does depend on your application. If you do tend to do much thinner coats, it's totally possible you might need a 3rd for this, especially if your nails are even longer than mine. I absolutely loved this one. I love deep blues, and this one I think is kind of an in-between of a peacock blue and a navy. It is so incredibly stunning, and I love how the flakies glow in this, though because this one was so dark, I feel like the flakies were a little bit more obscured, and hopefully you can see those pops of green in this shade too. And here is the collage of my full hand swatches for the After the Rain collection. I absolutely love how cozy these shades are. They are just so beautiful, so rich. I just really love this lineup. Moving on to comparisons, we're starting with Dark Roast and looking at it next to Shapeshifter and Timber. These are just 2 other specialty finish browns from ILNP, but you can just see how wildly different they all are, obviously both in terms of color and finish. When I first saw Dark Roast, I was immediately reminded of Chocolate, which was from the Campground collection. It's just a milk chocolate sort of crelly. I thought they were going to be much more similar, but you can see that Chocolate is a little bit warmer. And when it came to recreating these shades, I first pulled out Holo Taco's Fallen Flake Taco, but that's a metallic multi-chrome that's mainly orange and pink and some pops of other colors. So I settled on using Holo Taco's Lunar Unicorn Skin, which is a gold to green to orange shifting iridescent flaky. So here's 1 coat of that over 2 coats of Chocolate, and it's similar vibes but not dupes. I also, of course, had to show this next to a couple of Cirque jelly. So we have Cocoa Jelly on the left and Zen Jelly on the right. Again, I immediately thought of Cocoa Jelly being this like warmer chocolate brown, but that is just way too warm. I almost doubted myself grabbing Zen Jelly because in my mind, I just remembered that to be so gray, taupey almost. But seeing these side by side, they definitely are much closer to being dupes. They definitely look like dupes on the first coat, which isn't surprising, but doing a second coat, there is a tiny bit of difference where Zen is maybe a little bit darker or just more opaque, but also a tiny bit warmer. So again, layering Lunar Unicorn Skin on top of that will definitely give you a very similar result to Dark Roast. And while I was going through my Cirque drawer, I also pulled out Terroir, if I'm pronouncing that right, which I thought was going to be a somewhat similar base color. That one is a cream though, so you know, I still wanted to show it just in case. It's kind of similar when it comes to those moody fall vibes, but Terroir is a bit more plummy or taupe. And lastly, I have a quick bottle comparison next to Mooncat's Stumped, which is their dark brown jelly flaky balm. That one is a much deeper, warmer shade of brown though. Moving on to Raincoat, here it is next to Autumn and Carved. Autumn is a bit more of a brownish base color, but with a very strong yellowy orange shimmer. I thought Carved looked pretty different, especially seeing them side by side in the bottle, where it looks like it has a brighter orange base color with a yellowy golden microflaky. But surprisingly, they did look kind of close on the nail, though the shimmer particle in that is much more densely packed, so I think that's what brightens up the color a bit more. I did also want to show this next to Hidden Path from the Vineyard collection, which is another rusty orange jelly base, but this one is filled with a scattered hollow glitter. And on the right I have Caramel, which I again thought was going to be much closer to the base color of Raincoat, but that one is a little bit lighter, slightly more yellowy brown, like a true caramel shade. Raincoat and Hidden Path definitely have that much more rusty orange color. I didn't really have anything quite like Ginger Snap, at least not from ILNP. The closest specialty finish, neutral kind of shades that I had were Cookie Cutter and Toasted, but hopefully you can tell that those are just way too light and more neutral. Ginger Snap again has more of that reddish undertone, so I would say Cookie Cutter is a little bit closer in terms of value, but not in undertone. And in case you were curious, here is Ginger Snap next to Daybreak and Misty from the Overcast collection. Those are the lighter two sort of neutrally shades. They're looking very washed out here on camera, but even in real life, I think my Daybreak may be faded. And lastly, I wanted to show Ginger Snap next to Holo Taco's Ginger Snatched, which is a cream, but it was surprisingly close. I think it's maybe a little bit warmer, but doing 2 coats of that with Lunar Unicorn skin on top is giving we have Ginger Snap at home. Moving on to Stormwatch, here it is next to Pitter Patter from the Overcast collection. That one is much more periwinkle leaning, not really a true gray, so I wouldn't call them dupes at all. For some other grays, I wanted to pull out Rain, which is a much darker gray, so I ended up not showing that on the nail, but I knew I had to show this next to Flicker, which is from a Halloween collection. That one obviously has a much finer or smaller shimmer particle as opposed to the larger iridescent flakies, but they are almost the same kind of color where they go from orange to yellow and obviously both in gray bases, though I would say that Flicker is a little bit lighter and maybe cooler toned. When it came to recreating Stormwatch, I first pulled out Cirque's Dove Jelly, which is on the left, but that one is much lighter and maybe a little bit warmer toned, and the only other gray jelly I have is Cracked Polish's Dark Like My Heart, which looks like a much darker charcoal gray, so I figured I could kind of combine those two. So I did 2 coats of Dark Like My Heart, 1 coat of Dove Jelly on top of that, and then Lunar Unicorn skin, and I feel like it was kind of close. And lastly, here's a quick bottle comparison to Mooncat's Triceratops, which is their gray jelly base filled with iridescent flakies. The gray base is much darker and cooler toned, and the flakies are more blue and green. Next for Jumping Puddles, here it is next to Rainy Days and Thundercloud from the Overcast collection. I would call Rainy Days a very true denim kind of blue. It's definitely very grayed out, similar to Thundercloud. I mean, that one is a blue-gray sort of shade, or a slate gray, which is how Jumping Puddles is described, but I guess I just wouldn't agree with that since that one looks much more saturated in color. So between the two, it is closer to Rainy Days, but Jumping Puddles has warmer flakies. And here it is next to Starlight, which I feel like is picking up very blue here on camera, but that one's kind of more of a blurply shade or like a dusty indigo, so definitely very different. And for my recreation attempt, I immediately pulled out Cirque's Navy Jelly since I thought that was going to be a pretty close dupe for the base of Jumping Puddles, but doing 3 coats of that, it was just too dark, too muted. If anything, maybe that one is closer to Starlight. And finally, for Drizzle, I did also want to show this one next to Starlight, just because that's the darkest blue-ish shade from the Overcast collection, but it is so much more muted compared to how pigmented and saturated Drizzle is. So that color actually reminded me a lot more of Snowstorm from the Winter Resort collection. I would say that that one is maybe more of a true peacock blue color, so maybe there's a bit more of a teal undertone in that one. Hopefully you can see the slightly navy leaning shade of Drizzle. And for my recreation attempt, I first grabbed Cirque's Indigo Jelly, which is just a very dark, inky blue jelly, but that is just so much brighter. It's less of that peacock color, so I wouldn't call it a dupe at all. And lastly, I wanted to see this next to Olive Ave's Signature, which is one of their creams from a previous winter collection. I thought it was surprisingly close, so honestly, this is another combo that's giving we have Drizzle at home. So that wraps up my swatches and comparisons of ILNP's After the Rain collection. As always, I would love to know your thoughts on this release because I am really loving it. Don't get me wrong, I still am aghast that we are seeing fall collections in the middle of summer. Like, it's still July. So as a seasonal wearer, I am not going to be wearing these until September at the earliest, but I already know once the weather starts to cool down, I am going to be so excited to actually wear them. They are just so beautiful. I mean, obviously being the fall version of like a sister collection to Overcast, which was one of my favorite collections from ILNP, you just can't go wrong with them. Although I was a little nervous at first because half of the collection is very similar to Overcast with the blues and the gray. But as you saw during the comparison portion, these are definitely very different. Like, they play well with Overcast, but they're not close enough to be dupes at all. These are much more saturated colors, especially the blues. So I definitely get that they might feel a little repetitive, but at the same time, I think they do pair so beautifully with the warmer, more earthy kind of shades. So as always, I would love to know your thoughts on these, which ones are your favorites, or if you're going to be grabbing the whole collection. These are going to be launching on Friday, August 1st at a discounted pre-order price for, I believe it's 3 days before going to their full retail price, which is $12.50. And in case you somehow missed it, ILNP also has for sale their replacement brush packs, which come in a set of 10 for $7.50. So again, make sure to let me know any and all thoughts you have down below so we can chat about it. But thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!